Welcome back to ESBR Boxing's YouTube channel. Delighted as always to be joined by Danny. This is a video reflecting on the result on the scorecards that we saw last Saturday night in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, between Artur Beterbiev and Dmitry Bivol. Danny, good to be joined by you as always. Boxing always has its fair share of controversy, whether it's scorecards, bad refereeing, failed drugs tests, and you always seem to get a bit of controversy around the big fights. Beterbiev majority decision win on Saturday. Three different scorecards. I'm going to start this conversation off by asking how did you have it? Who won and what was your scorecard?
Look, very close fight. I mean, first thing I want to say is, the robbery shouts I find a bit ridiculous. I had it 7-5 to Beterbiev. I give Bivol the first four rounds. I give him the ninth round, and I give Beterbiev everything else. You can make a case for a draw. Absolutely, you can make a case for Bivol by one round. I can see that. I actually don't think maybe that's what we're going to come on to. I'll come on to it in detail. I don't think the 8-4 Beterbiev is that bad a scorecard. We've seen a lot worse scorecards. I had Beterbiev winning the fight. Look, people people have brought up this whole like, oh, how much should we score aggression? Controlled and effective aggression is part of the scoring criteria for boxing. It's a of all the criterias, if you're gonna like, right, who do I edge that one to? That's the one that you can easily decide. He was making the fight all night. The aggression was clearly effective. You have to look at Dmitry Bivol's face to show that it was effective. He was landing the more hurtful punches. I can understand, Dmitry Bivol was landing a lot of or throwing a lot of sort of eye-catching flurries, but people talk about how Beterbiev was sort of landing around like the side of the head and bits on the gloves. Four out of the five punches that Bivol would throw in those flurries to me looked like they were landing on the gloves or falling short or, being overextended. But yeah, I had Beterbiev winning the fight by a round.
Yeah, look, I had Beterbiev winning the fight by a round as well. I think the vast majority of people are saying that they wouldn't have minded seeing either fighter win. It's one of those when I'm a bit like it's no surprise one of the judges had the fight as a draw. But I do want to ask you, why do you think there's been such an outrage over this 116, scorecard, Danny? Because in my opinion, you can't say I'm okay with 115-13. That was my scorecard, but then have complete outrage about one round difference. That's my opinion. And I also just think it was one of those fights where a lot of the rounds are quite hard to score. So I just and saying Bivol won four rounds, it's not saying he performed poorly or it's not it's not an insult to him. I just think sometimes you have 12 rounds in a fight and you have eight of those rounds are really close and you just give the majority of those rounds to a certain fighter. Those the other fighter hasn't performed badly in those rounds. The other fighter has just kind of pipped them. That's it, and that's happened more than once. Just your thought. There was just your thoughts on kind of the outrage of that of on that 116, scorecard.
I think you've broke that down absolutely
Mm.
excellently. I think to get to that 8-4 scorecard, you have there, as you said, there were a lot of close rounds in that fight, a lot of swing rounds in that fight. You have to give Beterbiev all of them, which is a perfectly fine thing to do. If you see, I think, oh, it was a really close fight, but you have a 51-49 round to Beterbiev, you still
Mm.
score him the round. And the reason how like everybody here was that how can you give four rounds to Dmitry Bivol? He won four rounds in that fight relatively clearly for me. The rest I edged to Beterbiev. I can see how you can give them. Not the rest I edged to Beterbiev, all bar one I gave to Beterbiev. But I think that sort of people don't can't separate how it sounds without whilst getting into the detail of how you score a round in boxing. It was an extremely close fight. It was probably, it was a nip and tuck fight. But I think the reason, people get so wound up about it is because having the fight 8-4 makes it sound like, Beterbiev won 8 rounds clearly, which is not the case. He didn't win 8 rounds clearly. For me, he didn't win 8 rounds. But you've explained that better than I have. I think people a lot of people they forget how rounds are scored, and an 8-4 scorecard doesn't tell the story of the fight, but you're not scoring the fight as a whole, you're scoring it round by round. So yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's why.
And it's kind of sad in the way that you've had to say that. You don't just you don't just watch a fight and think, oh, I think they won because they looked good most of the time. It doesn't work like that. If you kind of smash the other guy to pieces in 3 rounds, but you then lose the other nine, you then lose the fight. That's not how it's
Yeah.
just it's
Even if those other nine are like terrible rounds where like you landed three jabs and they've landed two, you still win that fight even if you were getting battered for the first three. That's just how it is.
yeah, it's a wild sport, isn't it? And I feel like you have people on the expert end of the spectrum, and then you have people on Twitter who have never really properly watched a fight in their lives. I think another thing I'd like to add as well is I do think that Eddie Hearn's reaction. He had a very passionate reaction after the fight. He clearly cares a lot about his fighters, but I do think that's had kind of a domino effect, and a lot of people, fans, kind of look up to him and always look for what he's got to say. And I do think that's contributed to a lot of people then saying, "Yeah, Bivol, that scorecard was a disgrace. Bivol should have won that fight." Um, so yeah, that's kind of my reading of it. I know that. I don't know. I think it's Bivol's manager is going to file an official complaint, which I just thinks crazy. And another thing to add as well, we have seen so many worse scorecards in the last couple of years. The second one scorecard that springs to mind to myself was one judge had Joshua beating Usyk in their
About to
rematch.
say that.
Yeah, one judge had Fury beating Usyk earlier this year. In my opinion, those scorecards are far worse than that scorecard. That's my opinion.
I just one thing I want to say is this is a point you made earlier in the video is like you've seen so many people say that like 7-5 that's completely fine. 8-4 that judge should never fight again, should be investigated for corruption. It just absolutely is ludicrous.
yeah, it's bonkers. I think yeah, I don't want to kind of get to the point where we've kind of been shouting at the screen for an hour, Dennis. So we'll wrap things up. But is there anything you think can be done? Like part of me is tempted to say let things crack on. Those scorecards were actually fine on Saturday. But would you want to see anything, i.e., there's been more discussions about open scoring. There's been more discussions about maybe kind of referees maybe explaining themselves after the fight. I don't know what you think of those two things, but is there anything kind of top line you'd like to see change when it comes to judges' scorecards, whether it be post fight or whether it be kind of happen in general?
I think open scoring's a good one. We saw it in the cards in Japan this weekend, and I think if there was open scoring during that fight, there would be none of this nonsense and hyperbole about that. Because at what point in that fight, would people say, "Oh, how have you gave Beterbiev that round?" I've not seen because obviously the scorecards have came out now. I've not seen anyone say like, "How is that judge gave him that round?" You know what I mean? Because there was no egregious scoring of any rounds, and I think open scoring would people forget what happens, don't they? They forget, the sort of minor points of a round and they forget what's happened in rounds, that have happened 20 minutes before. They just have their sort of narrative in the fight. But I think open scoring would go a good way to, get rid of like some of the knee-jerk reactions because I don't think if that was in place during the fight on Saturday, after 6 round, if it came up that it was what, 3-3 or 4-2, Beterbiev, that there'd be, oh, like, how's he got there? I don't think that's, what the reaction would have been like.
Absolutely. I think just final one from me is I was kind of reading an article on BBC Sports today, which just broke down the rounds, and after the 12 rounds, all three judges agreed on 10 of them. So it's not one of these things where scorecards are all over the place. Three judges actually really agreed on on the vast majority of the rounds. It's just two rounds, round four and round seven, where the judges disagree. So it's three judges kind of giving very similar scorecards across the board. So I really don't think there's too much to complain about. But we'll see. Look, we'll be here discussing scorecards again, rightly or wrongly, but